Chapter 1. The End Begins. Part 1. The Silence Before the Fall. No one noticed when it started, and that may have been the first mistake, because there was no explosion, no massive invasion, no signal announcing that something was wrong, just silence, quiet, distant, easy to ignore at first, the kind of silence that blends into the background of a galaxy that is far too vast for anyone to monitor perfectly. It began in a small system at the edge of coalition space, a place with no strategic value, no major resources, just another world among hundreds connected by trade routes and constant communication, and one day, without warning, it stopped responding. At first, no one was concerned. Communication failures were common enough, storms, interference, technical issues, all of it part of daily operations across such a massive network. Messages were resent. Automated systems tried to re-establish contact. Routine protocols were followed, and still, nothing came back. So they sent a reconnaissance ship, and it never returned. Even then, there was no panic, just a slight shift in attention, a small irregularity that needed to be checked. So a second ship was sent, better equipped, prepared for possible hazards, ready to deal with anything unexpected. That one didn't come back either. That was when the concern began to grow. Not fear yet, but something colder, more analytical, a sense that something didn't add up, because the coalition had faced dangers before, pirates, isolated hostilities, unknown phenomena, but there was always a pattern, always a cause, always something that could be understood. This had none of that. When a small fleet was finally dispatched, the truth was impossible to ignore. The planet was still there, orbiting its star exactly as it should, structurally intact. Cities still standing, no signs of orbital bombardment, no visible damage, nothing that suggested a battle had taken place. But there was no life, no biological readings, no signals, no movement. Entire cities, frozen in place, as if time itself had stopped the moment whatever happened. It didn't make sense. Surface teams were deployed, scanners were used across every layer of the planet, atmosphere, soil, structures. Everything was analyzed, and nothing explained what they were seeing. No toxins, no radiation spikes, no biological agents, no trace of any known weapon. It was a dead world with no cause. And then it happened again. Another system went silent. This time, the response was faster, more cautious, but the result was the same. The fleet arrived, scanned the planet, and found another world exactly like the first, intact, silent, empty. Now it was a pattern. And patterns meant danger. The reports started to change tone. What had been isolated incidents were now being connected, analyzed as part of something larger, something spreading. Data from ancient archives was pulled, fragments of forgotten records, incomplete references, pieces of information that no one had considered relevant for thousands of years. That was when the name appeared. Vark. No one could say where it came from. It wasn't part of any active database. No living species recognized it. But it existed, buried deep in old records, mentioned in ways that suggested it had been known once, and then somehow forgotten. Still, there was no confirmation, only speculation. The coalition did what it always did. It organized, reinforced its borders, deployed additional fleets, activated defensive protocols, and prepared for contact, assuming that whatever this was, it would follow the same fundamental rules as every other known threat. It didn't. The first confirmed encounter came without warning. A fleet moving to secure a third system suddenly lost sensor clarity for a fraction of a second, just long enough for something to appear where there had been nothing before, shapes forming out of distortion, structures that didn't look built but grown, shifting in ways that defied standard design. The coalition ships opened fire immediately, energy weapons lighting the void, targeting systems struggling to lock onto something that didn't behave like a normal object. For a moment, it looked like they were hitting something. Readings showed impact. Fragments broke away. There was damage. And then the enemy responded. It wasn't an attack in the traditional sense. It was faster than that. Ships began disappearing. Not exploding. Not breaking apart. Just gone. Sensor locks vanished instantly, as if the ships had never existed. As if something had simply removed them from reality without leaving anything behind. Communications filled with confusion, then panic, orders overlapping, systems failing, attempts to retreat, to regroup, to understand what was happening, and then, One by one, the signals cut out. Silence returned. When long-range sensors stabilized, there was nothing left. No debris, no survivors, no explanation. That was the moment everything changed. Because now it was real. The Vark were not a theory. They were not a possibility. They were here. And whatever they were, they didn't come to negotiate. They didn't come to occupy. They didn't come to communicate. They came to erase. And they were just getting started. Part 2, First Contact. At first, they believed there was still time. Time to study the enemy. Time to understand what was happening. Time to respond the way they always had for thousands of years. The coalition had faced threats before, and it had always survived, not through brute force, but through coordination, strategy, and the ability to adapt together. But this time, it was different, because whatever was out there adapted faster. After the first fleets disappeared, military command shifted its approach. This was no longer an investigation, it was containment. Defensive lines were established, key systems were reinforced, and for the first time in centuries, the coalition entered a full state of alert. And still, it wasn't enough. The fourth system fell in less than 6 hours. This time, they had live transmission. The recordings began normally, routine communications, fleet coordination, defensive positions being formed, and then everything changed. The visuals started to distort, as if space itself was being pulled apart. Coalition ships opened fire immediately, beams of energy cutting through the void as they tried to hit something they could barely track. For a few seconds, it looked like it was working. Some of the enemy forms were hit, fragments broke away, damage readings appeared across the sensors, and for a brief moment, there was hope. Then the enemy responded, and it was too fast. Ships started disappearing one by one, not exploding, not breaking apart in any recognizable way, just vanishing. Sensor locks dropped instantly, as if the ships had never been there to begin with. It wasn't destruction in the way they understood it, it was erasure. The transmissions filled with voices. Orders being shouted, systems failing, desperate attempts to retreat, and then silence. It all happened in minutes. When the signal stabilized, there was nothing left. No debris, no survivors, not even enough data to explain what had just happened. That was the moment the name, Vark, stopped being a theory and became a reality. Reports changed after that. The tone shifted. This was no longer about understanding the threat. It was about surviving it. Strategies were rewritten in real time. Scientists worked without pause trying to identify patterns, weaknesses, anything that could be used against the enemy. But the problem remained. There were no clear patterns, no familiar logic. And the more data they collected, the less it made sense. The enemy structures didn't follow known technological principles. They shifted, reformed, reacted differently to each type of attack. In one moment, they seemed vulnerable, in the next completely untouchable. It was as if each encounter was with a different version of the same entity. And that made planning impossible. On the battlefield, commanders began noticing something even worse. The enemy formations weren't chaotic, even if they appeared that way at first glance. There was intelligence behind their movement, something coordinating them, but not like a traditional command structure. It was more like a shared awareness, as if each unit was part of something larger, something that was watching, learning, adapting. Then came the first major counterattack. A massive fleet was assembled, larger than anything deployed so far. It was a show of force, a clear attempt to stop the enemy's advance before more systems were lost. The plan was simple: overwhelm them with numbers and firepower. If there was a moment to turn the war around, this was it. When the fleets met, space lit up with weapon fire. For the first time since the conflict began, it looked like the coalition had the advantage. Vark ships were being hit, some were being destroyed, and for a brief moment, commanders believed they had finally found a way to fight back. But that moment didn't last, because the enemy changed. In the middle of the battle, it adapted. Formations shifted instantly, movement patterns evolved, and suddenly the attacks started hitting precise points across the coalition fleet, as if the enemy already knew exactly where the weaknesses were. Defensive systems went down first. Communications followed. Then came the collapse. Coalition ships that had been advancing seconds before began to fall back in disarray. Some tried to hold position, others attempted to escape, but nothing worked. It felt like the enemy was always one step ahead, anticipating every move before it was fully made. And then the destruction escalated. This time, there were survivors. Not many, but enough. And what they described wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. They spoke of ships being torn apart as if they had no defenses at all, of systems shutting down instantly, of entire crews disappearing without warning. Some described something even more unsettling, the feeling of being watched, studied, as if every action they took was being analyzed in real time. When those survivors returned, one truth became impossible to ignore. The coalition wasn't facing a stronger enemy. It was facing a smarter one. And that made everything worse. Because strength can be challenged. Technology can be overcome. But something that learns from every mistake you make, something that evolves during the fight itself, that is something else entirely. Systems began falling faster after that. Planets were evacuated in panic. Trade routes collapsed. Communication networks became unstable. What had once been a solid, unified structure was starting to crack, slowly at first, but accelerating with every loss. And for the first time, defeat was no longer a distant possibility. It was becoming reality. The enemy kept advancing, always advancing. And no matter how hard they fought, it kept getting stronger. And deep down, even without saying it out loud, everyone started to understand something they didn't want to face. There might not be a way to win this. And if that was true, then everything the coalition had built over thousands of years was already coming to an end. Part 3. When hope starts to break. At first, the coalition didn't collapse all at once. It didn't shatter in a single moment or fall because of one decisive battle. It was slower than that, more subtle, like cracks forming beneath the surface of something that had always seemed unbreakable. And that was what made it dangerous. Because for thousands of years, the coalition had been stable. Systems were connected, trade flowed constantly, communication networks stretched across hundreds of worlds, and every species believed in something simple, that no matter what happened, the structure would hold. That belief started to fade, not because of what the Vark destroyed, but because of what they made everyone realize. The coalition wasn't prepared for this. At first, the military losses were contained within reports, numbers, datasets that could be analyzed and discussed behind closed doors. But as the Vark continued advancing, those losses became impossible to hide. Civilian systems started going dark. Trade routes stopped responding. Entire colonies vanished without warning. And for the first time in generations, fear wasn't limited to soldiers. It reached everyone. Messages flooded the central networks. Requests for evacuation, emergency signals, desperate calls for help from systems that knew they wouldn't last much longer. Governments tried to maintain order, to reassure their populations, but the truth was spreading faster than any official statement could control. No one understood what was happening. And worse, no one knew how to stop it. Inside military command, the situation was even more unstable than it appeared from the outside. Strategies were being rewritten daily, sometimes hourly, as new data came in, but every adjustment seemed to fall apart as quickly as it was created. What worked once failed the next time. What slowed the enemy became useless hours later. It wasn't just that the Vark were winning. It was that they were improving. Commanders started noticing patterns that weren't supposed to exist. Battle reports showed that the Vark were reacting faster in each encounter, targeting critical systems earlier, bypassing defenses that had just been deployed. It was as if every engagement was feeding them information, and they were learning from it. The realization spread quietly at first, passed between analysts and high-ranking officers, never officially confirmed but impossible to ignore. The more they fought, the stronger the enemy became. That changed everything, because it meant that every battle wasn't just a risk. It was an advantage for the Vark. Morale began to drop. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, like pressure building over time. Soldiers who had spent their entire lives believing in the strength of the coalition were now facing something they couldn't predict, couldn't understand, and couldn't defeat with the tools they had. Some fleets started hesitating before engaging. Others followed orders, but without confidence. And a few didn't follow orders at all. There were reports of ships breaking formation, retreating without command authorization, even abandoning positions that were supposed to be held at all costs. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of fear. And fear spreads. As more systems fell, evacuation protocols were activated on a scale never seen before. Billions of civilians were relocated, entire populations moving through space, overcrowding stations, filling transport routes beyond capacity. Worlds that had stood for centuries were being abandoned in days. And even that wasn't enough. Because the Vark didn't slow down. They didn't pause between systems. They didn't show any sign of reaching a limit. They just kept advancing. Always advancing. Inside the council, the atmosphere had changed completely. Where there had once been confidence, now there was tension. Where decisions had once been made with clarity, now they were delayed, questioned, second-guessed. Not because the leaders were incapable, but because the situation itself didn't allow certainty. Every option carried risk. Every decision could make things worse. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, a new kind of thinking began to take hold. Not how to win, but how to survive. Discussions shifted. Instead of focusing on stopping the Vark, they began prioritizing which systems could still be saved, which populations could still be evacuated, which parts of the coalition might survive if everything else was lost. It was a subtle change, but it meant one thing. They were preparing for defeat. Tekken saw it happening. He didn't need reports or data to understand it. He could see it in the way the others spoke, in the hesitation before decisions, in the quiet acceptance that had started to replace determination. And that worried him more than the enemy itself. Because civilizations don't fall only when they are destroyed. They fall when they stop believing they can survive. And the coalition was getting dangerously close to that point. Still, there was something else. Something buried beneath all the data, all the reports, all the chaos. Something that didn't fit. It started as fragments. Old references that didn't belong in modern analysis. Mentions of past encounters. Incomplete records from thousands of years ago. Data that had been archived and forgotten long before most current species had even reached space. At first, it was ignored. Ancient history had no place in a war like this. But the references kept appearing. Different species, different archives, different timelines. And yet, they all pointed to the same thing. A species that didn't behave like the others. A species that came from a world classified as uninhabitable. A species that didn't just survive impossible conditions, but adapted to them. The names were different across the records. Some called them silent warriors. Others called them endurance hunters. Some described them as relentless. Others as unstoppable. But there was one word that appeared more often than the others. Human. No one took it seriously at first. It sounded like myth, like something exaggerated over time, the kind of story that civilizations create to explain things they don't understand. A species from a death world, surviving conditions that should kill intelligent life, fighting in ways that defied logic. It didn't fit with anything the coalition knew about evolution or biology. So it was dismissed, until the patterns started aligning. Because the descriptions, the behavior, the way those ancient records talked about adaptation, resilience, unpredictability, it felt familiar, uncomfortably familiar. And for the first time since the war began, a different kind of question started to form. Not about the Vark, but about something else. Something that might have existed before. Something that might still exist. And something that just might be the only thing capable of fighting back. But no one was ready to say it out loud yet. Because if those stories were true, then the coalition wasn't just facing extinction. It was about to reach out to something even more dangerous. Part 4. The signal from the void. At first, they didn't believe it was real. The data came from a long-range scout vessel operating far beyond the usual borders of coalition space, in regions that had been mapped but never fully explored. It was the kind of mission that rarely found anything significant, just empty systems, dead stars, fragments of forgotten space. Which is why no one expected what they found. The transmission arrived fragmented, partially corrupted, but the urgency in the message was unmistakable. The captain didn't follow standard reporting format, didn't wait for confirmation protocols, didn't even attempt to filter the data. He sent everything at once. Raw, unprocessed, desperate. At first, analysts thought it was an error. Sensor interference, data corruption, because what the ship was reporting wasn't possible. A star system completely surrounded by a defensive grid. Not a loose network. Not scattered installations. A complete perimeter. Every approach angle covered. Every entry point monitored. A structure so vast and so precise that it could not have been built recently. And yet, there were no records of it existing. That alone would have been enough to trigger investigation. But that wasn't the part that changed everything. The ship had sent a signal. Standard protocol. Ancient galactic common, a language that most species barely used anymore, kept only for archival communication and legacy systems. No one expected a reply, but they got one, and that was when everything shifted. The recording was played inside the council chamber in complete silence, every member watching, every system focused, every breath held without anyone realizing it. The voice that came through was clear, stable, controlled. It didn't sound distorted. It didn't sound artificial. It sounded human. This is Commander Jake Holland of the Human Defense Fleet. You have entered restricted space. Identify yourselves and state your purpose. No one spoke after that. For a moment, it felt like the entire room had stopped functioning, because that single message confirmed something no one had been ready to accept. The stories were real, not legends, not myths, not misinterpretations of ancient data. Real. Humans existed, and they weren't gone. They had been there the entire time, hidden, watching, waiting. The reactions came slowly. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something else, something harder to define. Fear. Because if even half of the old records were true, humans were not just another species. They were something different. Something that evolved under conditions no intelligent life was supposed to survive. Something that adapted not just to hardship, but to constant threat. The council erupted into discussion almost instantly, voices overlapping, questions being thrown across the room faster than they could be answered. Some demanded immediate contact, others warned against it, arguing that they knew nothing about this species beyond incomplete and possibly exaggerated records. But one thing was clear. They didn't have a choice, because while they were debating, the Vark were still advancing, still consuming, still getting closer. The scout ship remained at the edge of the system, holding position just outside the defensive grid. They hadn't been attacked yet, but the readings coming from their sensors were enough to keep every system on high alert. Weapons. A lot of them. Far beyond anything the Coalition had ever built. Tracking systems locked on the ship continuously, never disengaging, never relaxing. It wasn't aggression, but it wasn't trust either. The humans were watching, and they were ready. A second transmission was sent, this time from the council itself. Carefully constructed, direct, with no attempt to hide the situation. There was no room for deception, no space for political maneuvering. Just the truth. The Coalition was losing. Entire systems had fallen. Billions were dead. And if nothing changed, the galaxy would not survive. The response took time. Long enough to make the wait unbearable. Because every second that passed raised the same question in every mind inside that council. Would they help? Or would they stay hidden and let the galaxy burn? When the reply finally came, it was shorter than expected. Direct. Calculated. Commander Jake Holland agreed to a meeting. But with conditions. Humans had isolated themselves for a reason. They did not trust easily. They would not commit to anything without understanding exactly what they were facing. And more importantly, they made something very clear. If the Coalition was lying, they would walk away. No second chances. No negotiations. Just silence. The decision was made quickly after that. A diplomatic team would be sent. Not a fleet. Not a show of force. Just representatives. People who could speak. Explain. Convince. Ambassador Khalees was chosen to lead. Lyra insisted on going. She had studied ancient records her entire life, spent years analyzing fragments of data that most considered irrelevant, and now, for the first time, she had a chance to see if any of it was true. Commander Vrex was assigned as escort. He didn't believe in legends, didn't believe in stories about death-world species or unstoppable warriors. As far as he was concerned, if humans existed, they were just another civilization. And like any other, they could fall. Before departure, Tekken called Khalees aside. He didn't speak loudly, didn't make a speech. He just gave one warning. Tell them the truth. Do not hide how desperate we are. And remember this, if the stories are even partially true, humans are not like us. Khalees didn't ask what he meant, because deep down, he already understood. The diplomatic ship left hours later. A small vessel, carrying the last hope of a civilization that had never needed saving before. Behind them, the war continued. Systems were still falling. The Vark were still advancing. And somewhere ahead, beyond that defensive grid, was something unknown, something ancient, something that might be the only chance left, or the beginning of something even worse. Part 5, The Death World. The journey took 5 days. 5 days crossing space that felt quieter than it should, as if even the stars ahead were holding something back. Inside the diplomatic ship, no one said it out loud, but the tension was constant, sitting in every silence, in every glance exchanged between the crew. They weren't just traveling toward another system. They were heading into the unknown. As the ship approached the coordinates provided by the humans, the first thing that appeared on the sensors didn't make sense. At first, it looked like interference, like overlapping signals that couldn't be properly interpreted, but as they got closer, the readings stabilized. And that was when they saw it. A complete defensive grid. Not scattered stations. Not a loose perimeter. A perfectly structured barrier surrounding the entire system. Every possible entry point was covered. Every angle monitored. And the scale of it was impossible to ignore. This wasn't something recently built. It was old. Extremely old. And still, fully operational. Lyra stared at the data in disbelief, running the numbers again and again, hoping she had miscalculated something, but the results didn't change. The energy output alone was beyond anything the coalition could sustain, and yet the system showed no signs of instability. They've been maintaining this for thousands of years, she whispered, almost to herself. Vrex didn't respond immediately. His attention was locked on something else. Weapons. Every part of that grid was armed, and not in a defensive, passive way. Every system was active, tracking them, following every movement the ship made. They're ready to fire at any moment, he said quietly. But they didn't. Instead, the diplomatic vessel received a transmission. Coordinates. Clear. Direct. A path through the grid. Permission to enter. The ship moved forward slowly, crossing the defensive perimeter under constant surveillance. Even after passing through, the sensors never unlocked. The targeting systems followed them the entire time, adjusting in real time, calculating, predicting. They don't trust us, Vrex muttered. Khalees answered without looking away from the viewport. Would you after 10,000 years alone? No one replied, because the answer was obvious. As they moved deeper into the system, the third planet came into view. And that was when everything changed. Lyra's instruments started reacting before she even fully understood what she was looking at. Alerts triggered across her console, warnings stacking on top of each other faster than she could process. Those readings, that's not possible. She adjusted the scan parameters, thinking there was an error. There wasn't. Gravity. Too high. Atmospheric pressure. Too dense. Oxygen levels. Dangerously elevated. Everything about that planet pointed to one conclusion. It's a death world, she said, her voice barely steady. Vrex leaned closer, checking the data himself, his expression tightening as he confirmed it. Not just any death world, a high-level one. The kind used in military simulations. The kind where survival wasn't expected. The kind where intelligent life wasn't supposed to exist. And yet, the sensors showed billions of life signs. Khalees looked at the planet through the viewport, silent for a moment, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he knew. They evolved there, he said quietly. Not survived. Evolved. The ship was guided toward a station orbiting the planet, and as they approached, another detail became impossible to ignore. The station's internal settings were being adjusted for them, but only partially. The gravity was lower than the planet's surface, but still higher than most coalition species were used to. The air composition was different. Heavier. Sharper. Uncomfortable. This isn't their normal environment, Lyra realized. They adjusted it for us. Vrex nodded slightly, but not completely, because they didn't need to. When the ship finally docked, the transition was immediate. Even with the adjustments, Lyra felt the weight pressing down on her body the moment she stepped out. Every movement required more effort. Every breath felt thicker, harder to process. And yet, the humans waiting for them didn't seem affected at all. They stood there calmly, relaxed, as if this environment was nothing. Lyra had studied the descriptions before, the ancient records, the fragmented data about human biology, but none of it truly prepared her for seeing them in person. They didn't look like warriors. They didn't have natural armor. No visible weapons. No obvious physical advantages. But when she looked into their eyes, she understood. There was something there. Something controlled. Something alert. Every movement calculated. Every detail observed. Predators. Not in the sense of aggression, but in awareness. In focus. In the way they processed the world around them. Commander Jake Holland stepped forward. His posture was calm, his expression neutral, but there was no hesitation in his presence. He wasn't trying to intimidate them. He didn't need to. "Welcome to Earth's orbital station," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "I understand you need our help." Khalees stepped forward, maintaining diplomatic composure, even under the pressure of everything they had just experienced. "Yes, we do." Jake studied them for a moment. Not casually, carefully, as if analyzing more than just their words. "Then you'd better start explaining," he said. "Because if you cross that grid to get here, whatever is out there must be serious." There was a brief pause, and for the first time since they left Coalition space, Khalees felt the full weight of the situation settle in. Because this wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a request between equals. This was something else entirely. They weren't asking for support. They were asking for intervention. And the beings standing in front of them were not like anything the Coalition had ever faced. Part 6. What humans really are. At first, it didn't look impressive. That was the most confusing part. After everything they had seen, after the defensive grid, the death world, the overwhelming systems surrounding the planet, Lyra expected something more obvious. Something that immediately explained why the ancient records spoke of humans with such intensity. But standing there, inside that station, looking at them directly, they seemed almost ordinary. No armor, no visible weapons, no physical traits that stood out compared to other species. Just beings. And that made it worse. Because nothing about what they had already seen matched that simplicity. Jake Holland didn't waste time with formalities. He turned and gestured for them to follow, moving through the station with a steady pace that forced the others to adjust just to keep up. Even with the reduced gravity, Lyra could feel the strain building in her body, each step heavier than it should be, each movement requiring more effort. The humans around them didn't slow down, didn't even seem to notice. "This way," Jake said, without looking back. They moved through corridors that felt different from Coalition structures. The design was more compact, more efficient, everything placed with purpose, no wasted space, no unnecessary elements. It wasn't built to impress. It was built to function. And that detail didn't go unnoticed. They eventually reached a large viewing area overlooking a training field, and that was where everything changed. At first, it just looked like organized movement. Groups of human soldiers running across the field, carrying equipment, following patterns that seemed routine. But the longer Lyra watched, the more the details started to stand out. They weren't just running. They were pushing their bodies far beyond what should be sustainable. Long distances, heavy loads, no visible signs of exhaustion. "They've been going for how long?" Rex asked. Jake answered without hesitation. 2 hours. Lyra blinked, thinking she misheard. "That's not possible." Jake didn't argue. He didn't need to, because the evidence was right there. The soldiers kept moving, maintaining pace, maintaining coordination, not slowing down, not breaking formation. And when one of them stumbled, hitting the ground hard enough to leave a visible impact, the reaction wasn't what Lyra expected. He didn't stop. He got up, adjusted his position, and kept going. "He's injured," she said. "He'll be fine," Jake replied calmly. And somehow, that answer felt worse than anything else. They moved to another section of the facility where the training was different, closer, more violent, hand-to-hand combat. 2 human soldiers engaged in a controlled fight, but there was nothing gentle about it. Every movement was precise, efficient, focused on ending the fight as quickly as possible. Strikes that would cripple most species were absorbed, redirected, countered with something even stronger. One of them took a direct hit that should have ended the exercise. He didn't stop. He adapted. And within seconds, he had regained control. Lyra felt something shift inside her. This wasn't training the way she understood it. This was conditioning. They were preparing for damage, for failure, for survival under pressure that would break most beings. "They don't avoid pain," she said quietly. Jake looked at her for a moment. "No," he answered. "We learn to function through it." That single sentence explained more than any data ever could. They continued moving through the facility, each section revealing something new, something that made less and less sense from the Coalition's perspective. Human pilots training under extreme acceleration forces that would cause most species to lose consciousness instantly. And yet they remained focused, responsive, in control. "Your bodies shouldn't handle that," Lyra said, unable to hide her disbelief. Jake gave a small, almost absent response. They don't have a choice. That was the difference. Everything about humans seemed built around one idea: endure, adapt, continue, no matter what. But the most unsettling moment came later. They were brought into a simulation room, where a tactical exercise was already in progress. A group of human soldiers was facing a scenario that, based on coalition standards, had only one logical outcome: retreat. They were outnumbered, outgunned, outmatched. Every calculation pointed to failure. But the humans didn't retreat. They advanced. Fast, aggressive, unpredictable. They used terrain in ways that didn't follow standard doctrine, split their formation into smaller units without centralized command, made decisions independently, adapting to changes in real time. And somehow, they won. The simulation ended with complete neutralization of the opposing force. Vrex didn't speak immediately. When he finally did, his voice carried something new. That shouldn't have worked. Jake gave a slight nod. It usually doesn't. Lyra turned toward him. Then why do it? Jake looked back at the simulation display, now resetting for another scenario. Because sometimes, he said calmly, the impossible option is the only one left. That answer stayed with them. Because it wasn't just about tactics. It was about mindset. Humans didn't fight the way the coalition did. They didn't rely on fixed structures, predictable strategies, or rigid command systems. They adapted faster. They thought differently. And most importantly, they didn't stop when they were supposed to. Later, as they were escorted back through the station, the weight of everything they had seen settled in. Khalees finally spoke. If this is what your soldiers are like, then the stories weren't exaggerations. Jake didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. They were simplified. That was worse, because it meant the reality was even more extreme. And for the first time since arriving, a new question began to form in all of them. Not whether humans could help, but what would happen if they did. Because a species like that didn't just change a war. It changed everything. Part 7, The Human Decision. For 10,000 years, humanity had stayed out of it. No wars beyond their borders. No alliances. No interference. They built their defenses, sealed their space, and made one decision that defined generations: never again. Whatever had happened in the past, whatever war had pushed them into isolation, it had left a mark deep enough that an entire species chose distance over dominance, silence over expansion. And it worked. For thousands of years, no threat reached them. No enemy crossed their borders. No war forced them to fight. Until now. Inside Earth's central command chamber, the atmosphere felt heavier than any battlefield. Not because of physical pressure, but because of what was at stake. This wasn't a tactical decision. It wasn't about a single mission or a contained operation. This was about breaking 10,000 years of isolation. President Clara Morrison stood at the center of the room, listening, not interrupting, letting every voice be heard, because she knew that once a decision was made, there would be no going back. They're asking us to risk everything, one of the council members said, his voice firm, controlled, but carrying underlying tension. We don't know them. We don't know if their situation is exactly as they describe. And even if it is, this is not our war. Several others agreed. The isolationist position wasn't based on fear alone. It was built on history. Billions of human lives had been lost in the last war they fought before disappearing from the galaxy. Entire regions of space had been turned into graveyards. Humanity didn't isolate itself because it was weak. It did it because it understood the cost of war too well. We stayed out of galactic affairs for a reason, another voice added. If we step into this, we don't control what happens next. We don't know how far this conflict goes. Across the room, General Nathan Cross leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable, but his voice direct. We do know, he said. The room quieted. He activated the display, projecting battle data collected from coalition forces, reconstructed simulations of VARC engagements, projections based on their current rate of expansion. They don't stop, Cross continued. They don't negotiate, they don't retreat, and they don't lose ground. Every engagement makes them stronger. Every system they consume increases their resources. He paused for a moment, letting the information settle. If we wait, they don't disappear. They reach us. That shifted the room. Because that was the truth no one wanted to face. Isolation only works until something powerful enough ignores it. Dr. Sophie Bennett spoke next, her tone calm, but firm. We're not deciding whether to join a war, she said. We're deciding when we're going to fight it. Silence followed, because that reframed everything. The debate was no longer about involvement. It was about timing. Still, not everyone was convinced. We don't know if they'll turn on us later, one council member argued. If we reveal ourselves, if we commit our forces, we become visible again. We become part of the galactic structure we chose to leave. That concern lingered, because trust was not something humanity gave easily anymore. Not after what they had experienced. Jake Holland stood near the edge of the room, silent until that moment. He had seen the coalition firsthand. He had seen their fear, their desperation, but also their resilience. He stepped forward, not as a politician, not as a strategist, but as someone who had already made his decision. I fought alongside them, he said. The room turned toward him. They're not perfect. They're not united the way we are. But they're trying. They're fighting something they don't understand, and they're still holding the line. He paused briefly. They didn't come here asking us to die for them. They came here asking us to stand with them. There was a difference, and everyone in that room understood it. Jake continued, his voice steady. If we do nothing, we stay safe a little longer. That's it. We don't stop what's coming. We just delay it. No one interrupted him, because deep down they all knew that was true. President Morrison finally spoke again, her voice calm, but carrying weight. What about the cost? That question changed the tone immediately, because this wasn't theory anymore. It was reality. General Cross answered without hesitation. It will be high. No attempt to soften it. No attempt to reassure. Just the truth. We will lose ships. We will lose people. And if this escalates the way we expect, we could be pulled into a full-scale war unlike anything we've seen in 10,000 years. That was the risk. Clear. Unavoidable. And still, the alternative was worse. Dr. Bennett looked around the room, then at the display showing the destroyed coalition systems. Those people out there, she said quietly, they're facing extinction. Not defeat. Extinction. She let that sit for a moment. If we have the ability to stop that, and we choose not to, then what exactly have we become? That question didn't need an answer, because it wasn't about strategy. It was about identity, who humanity had become after 10,000 years of isolation. Safe, hidden, untouched. But at what cost? Jake spoke again, softer this time. My grandfather used to tell me something, he said. He said being strong doesn't mean you avoid every fight. It means you know which ones matter. He looked around the room. This one matters. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It wasn't uncertainty. It was decision-forming. President Morrison took a slow breath, then straightened. We will not rush into this blindly, she said. We will send a fleet. Limited engagement. We assess their situation directly, confirm their claims, and observe how they fight. She paused. This is not full commitment. Not yet. It was a test. For the coalition. And for humanity. If they are telling the truth, she continued, and if this threat is what they say it is, then we reconsider. The decision was made. Not absolute. Not final. But enough to change everything. Jake didn't react outwardly, but internally, he knew. This was the beginning. Not just of a war, but of something much bigger. Because once humanity stepped back into the galaxy, there would be no going back to isolation. And somewhere out there, the Vark were still advancing, unaware that something had just entered the game, something they had never faced before. Part 8. When humans enter the war. The coalition didn't expect much. That was the truth no one said out loud. After everything they had lost, after watching entire fleets disappear and systems fall one after another, hope had become something fragile, something dangerous to hold on to. So when the message arrived confirming that humanity would send a fleet, the reaction wasn't celebration. It was caution, because they had seen powerful forces fail before. And the Vark didn't lose. The human fleet arrived at the Kelrose system 3 days later. 12 ships. That was it. 12. Against an enemy that deployed hundreds in a single wave. Admiral Thurin stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the human vessels emerge from warp, his expression unreadable. He had spent 2 years fighting a war he could not win, had seen strategies fail, weapons become useless, entire fleets erased in minutes. And now this. 12 ships. They're smaller than I expected, one of his officers said quietly. Thurin didn't respond immediately, because size wasn't what caught his attention. It was how they moved. The human ships didn't drift into formation the way coalition vessels did. They adjusted constantly, subtle changes in position, speed, orientation, like they were already reacting to something before it even happened. "They're not waiting," Thurin said. And he was right. A transmission came through almost immediately. "This is Admiral Lisa Chun of the Human Defense Fleet. We're ready for engagement. Send us your enemy data." No hesitation. No delay. No uncertainty. Thurin sent everything they had: battle logs, sensor data, tactical records, every failed attempt, every pattern they had tried to analyze. If humans were going to fight, they needed to understand what they were facing. Minutes passed. Then the alarms triggered. 300 Vark bioships had entered the system, the largest force seen in weeks. "Defensive formation Delta," Thurin ordered immediately. It was the best they had, a structure designed to delay, to hold, to buy time for evacuation, not to win. He opened a channel again. "Admiral Chun, I strongly recommend you fall back to secondary line. This engagement will not hold." There was a brief pause. Then her response came. Calm, almost confident. "We didn't come here to fall back." Thurin frowned. "You're facing 300 units. Another pause. Then, "Good," she said. "We needed targets." And before he could respond, the human fleet moved. Not into defensive formation. Not into alignment with coalition strategy. They accelerated. Straight toward the Vark. "Are they?" one of the officers started. Thurin didn't finish the thought, because he was already watching it happen. The human ships surged forward at speeds coalition vessels simply could not reach without killing their own crews. Their movement wasn't linear, wasn't predictable. They twisted through space, adjusting constantly, making it nearly impossible for targeting systems to lock onto them. The Vark responded immediately. Their formations shifted. Weapons fired. Space itself seemed to distort as their attacks moved toward the incoming fleet. And then, the humans fired back. Thurin leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as he studied the sensor readings. "Those aren't energy signatures." His tactical officer hesitated. "No, sir, those are kinetic weapons." Thurin turned. "That technology is obsolete. It had been abandoned thousands of years ago. Energy weapons were more efficient, more adaptable, more advanced." "So why?" The answer came instantly. The projectiles hit. Solid mass. Accelerated to extreme velocities. They didn't burn. They didn't dissipate. They didn't give the Vark time to adapt. They tore through them. The first Vark ship split apart instantly. Then another. And another. The enemy reacted, adjusting its structure, trying to compensate, but it was too late. Their adaptive systems were built to counter energy, to shift against frequency, to resist heat and radiation. They couldn't adapt to something that didn't change. Pure impact. Pure force. In the first minute, 15 Vark ships were destroyed. Theron's bridge went silent. In the second minute, 20 more. "That's not possible," someone whispered. But it was happening. The Vark began to focus their fire, shifting attention entirely to the human fleet, recognizing the threat immediately. But even that response was too slow. The human ships didn't fight like a formation. They fought like individuals, breaking apart, reforming, attacking from impossible angles. No centralized pattern. No predictable movement. Every ship acting independently, but somehow still coordinated. It didn't make sense. Until it did. They're not following commands, Thurin realized. They're making decisions in real time. That was the difference. While coalition fleets waited for orders, maintained structure, followed command hierarchy, humans adapted instantly. Every pilot, every ship, thinking, reacting, evolving, faster than the Vark could process. A smaller human vessel broke through the enemy formation, diving directly into the center of the swarm. Its movement was reckless by coalition standards, completely outside any accepted strategy. But it worked. It disrupted the formation, created openings, and the others followed. The battlefield shifted, not gradually, violently. For the first time since the war began, the Vark were losing control. A coalition officer spoke, barely above a whisper. "They're winning." Thurin didn't answer, because he was watching something he had not seen in 2 years. The impossible. The Vark ships began to retreat. Not fully, not in panic, but they were pulling back, repositioning, breaking their advance. And that alone was something no coalition force had ever achieved. The battle continued for nearly 2 hours. When it ended, the numbers didn't make sense. Out of 300 Vark ships, less than 50 escaped. The rest were destroyed, drifting, silent, gone. Coalition losses were still heavy. Dozens of ships destroyed, hundreds of lives lost. But the humans lost none, damaged, but intact. Durin stood there, staring at the aftermath, unable to process what he had just witnessed. 2 years. 2 years of defeat. And in a single battle, everything changed. A transmission came through. Admiral Chin again. Admiral Durin, she said, her voice steady. That's how they fight. Now imagine what happens when we stop holding back. Durin didn't respond immediately, because for the first time, he wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about victory. And somewhere in the depths of space, the Vark were already adapting, because now they had something new to learn from. Humanity. Part 9. The Return of Hope. The news spread faster than any fleet could travel. It didn't matter how far a system was, how isolated a colony had become, or how damaged the communication networks were. The moment the battle data was released, the moment the first verified reports confirmed what had happened at Kelros, everything changed. For 2 years, every message had carried the same tone. Loss, retreat, failure, worlds falling one after another, fleets disappearing, systems going silent with no explanation and no survivors. People had learned to expect bad news, to brace for it, to live with the constant weight of knowing that the next update could be the one that reached them. But this time, it was different. This time, the message said something no one had heard since the war began. The Vark had been defeated, not slowed, not contained, defeated. Entire formations destroyed, hundreds of enemy units eliminated, and more importantly, they had been pushed back. At first, many didn't believe it. They thought it was misinformation, a misinterpretation of partial data, or worse, a desperate attempt to maintain morale. Because the idea that the Vark could lose, that something in the galaxy could actually stop them, didn't fit with everything they had experienced so far. But then more data came in. Clearer, verified, impossible to deny. 12 human ships had done what entire coalition fleets had failed to achieve. And that was when the reaction truly began. Across coalition space, something shifted. Not instantly, not completely, but enough to matter. Hope. Small at first. Careful. Almost fragile. Because after everything that had happened, trusting in hope again felt dangerous. It felt like opening a door that had already been closed too many times. But it was there, growing. Worlds that had been preparing for evacuation paused their plans, waiting for more information. Military outposts that had been holding defensive positions without expectation of survival started requesting redeployment orders. Communication channels that had been filled with panic and desperation began to carry something new. Questions. Who were the humans? Where had they been? And most importantly, could they really win this? Inside the council, the atmosphere had changed completely. The same room that had once been filled with silence and resignation was now alive with discussion, movement, urgency. Leaders who had been preparing for collapse were now reconsidering everything, reevaluating strategies, rebuilding plans that had already been abandoned. For the first time since the war began, victory was being discussed again. Tekken stood quietly, watching it all unfold. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to control the conversation, because he understood something the others were only just beginning to realize. This wasn't just a battle victory. This was a psychological shift. The coalition had been fighting to survive. Now, they might start fighting to win. But not everyone felt relief. Because alongside hope came something else. Uncertainty. The reports about the battle didn't just describe victory. They described how that victory was achieved. Human tactics, human weapons, human behavior. Independent units acting without centralized command. Ships engaging at speeds considered unsafe. Strategies that ignored standard doctrine completely. And results that seemed impossible. Some of the council members exchanged looks as they reviewed the data again. This is not how war is fought, one of them said quietly. Tekken finally spoke. No, he replied. This is how they fight. And that distinction mattered. Because it meant that humanity wasn't just stronger. It was different. Completely different. Meanwhile, back at Kelros, the reality of what had happened was still settling in. Coalition crews moved through the aftermath of the battle, scanning debris, rescuing survivors, trying to process what they had witnessed. For many of them, this had been the first time they saw the Vark lose. the first time they saw them retreat. And that alone was enough to change everything. Admiral Theron stood on the bridge, looking at the remaining human ships still moving through the system, their formations shifting, adjusting, as if the battle had never truly ended. They didn't hesitate, one of his officers said. Not once. Theron nodded slightly. They didn't need to, because hesitation came from uncertainty, and humans didn't seem uncertain. A transmission came through again. Admiral Lisa Chun. This was a test engagement, she said. Now we understand how they adapt. Theron looked at the data one more time. How long before they adapt to you? He asked. There was a brief pause. Then her answer came. They already are. That silence that followed felt different from the one before the battle. Because now, it wasn't about fear of losing. It was about understanding what came next. The Vark had faced something new. Something unpredictable. Something that didn't follow the rules. And they would learn from it. They always did. Which meant the next battle would not be the same. Back on Earth, the reports arrived quickly. Detailed. Complete. Unfiltered. Every movement, every tactic, every outcome analyzed and reviewed by human command. General Cross studied the data in silence, while Dr. Bennett focused on the behavioral patterns of the Vark response. They recognized the threat immediately, she said. They adjusted faster than expected. Cross nodded. But not fast enough. Yet, that word didn't need to be spoken, because both of them understood it. President Morrison received the final summary shortly after. Victory confirmed. Losses minimal. Enemy adaptation already in progress. She read it once. Then again. And slowly, she set it down. This changes everything, she said. And it did. Because the moment humanity entered the war, the balance shifted. But balance never stays still. It moves. It reacts. And somewhere in the darkness between systems, the Vark were already evolving, already preparing, already learning from the only species that had ever truly hurt them, humanity. And the next time they met, it wouldn't be a surprise. It would be a response. Part 10. The war has changed. The victory at Kelrose was never meant to be the end. It was a beginning. That became clear faster than anyone expected. At first, the coalition treated it as a turning point, a moment to regroup, to rebuild, to finally shift from defense to something more aggressive. Plans that had been abandoned were brought back, strategies rewritten with human involvement in mind, projections recalculated with something they hadn't had in 2 years. A real chance. But the humans didn't celebrate. They analyzed. Every second of the battle was broken down, every movement reviewed, every reaction studied in detail. What mattered wasn't the victory itself, it was what the Vark had done during it. How they responded, how they adapted, because that was the real war. Not what had already happened, but what would happen next. Inside Earth's command center, the tone had shifted completely. The limited engagement had served its purpose. There was no longer uncertainty about the scale of the threat, no doubt about the consequences of ignoring it. Now it was about commitment. General Nathan Cross stood before the assembled leadership, the Kelrose battle replaying behind him, showing the moments where the Vark formations shifted, where they began adjusting to human tactics. They're learning faster now, he said. Before, they were adapting to coalition patterns. Now they're adapting to us. That alone changed the equation. Dr. Sophie Bennett stepped forward, highlighting key points in the data. They didn't just react, she explained. They anticipated. By the end of the engagement, their targeting systems were already adjusting to kinetic trajectories. Not effectively yet, but they're getting there. And that meant one thing. Time was limited. The advantage humanity had brought into the war wouldn't last forever. President Morrison listened in silence, taking in the full scope of what they were facing. The decision she was about to make wasn't about helping anymore. It was about survival. If we stay at limited engagement, Cross continued, we slow them down. Maybe we hold the line for a while. But eventually, they catch up. And if we escalate? She asked. Cross didn't hesitate. We hit them before they adapt. That was the shift. From reaction to initiative. But escalation came with a cost. Not a small one. Full-scale deployment meant exposing everything humanity had kept hidden for 10,000 years. Fleet capacity, weapons systems, tactical doctrines, all of it would become visible, not just to the Vark, but to the entire galaxy. There would be no going back after that. No return to isolation. No way to disappear again. Jake Holland stood nearby, watching the discussion unfold. knowing that the decision had already been made in principle. This wasn't about whether humanity would fight. It was about how far they were willing to go. They won't stop, he said quietly. Not the Vark. Not until there's nothing left. No one disagreed, because they had all seen it. System after system, world after world, erased. President Morrison finally stood, and when she spoke, the room went completely silent. We don't wait, she said. No hesitation. No doubt. We commit full force. That was it. 10,000 years of isolation ended in a single sentence. Orders were issued immediately. Fleet mobilization began across every human-controlled sector. Shipyards activated at full capacity. Vessels that had not been deployed in centuries brought online. New formations assembled with a level of coordination that had not been seen since humanity's last Great War. Hundreds of ships. Then more. Support fleets. Strike groups. Recon divisions. Everything moving at once. This was no longer a test. This was war. Across coalition space, the announcement spread quickly. Human forces were not just assisting anymore. They were joining the war fully. For many, it was the confirmation they had been waiting for. Proof that the victory at Kelros wasn't a fluke. For others, it was something else. A realization. Because now they weren't just fighting alongside humans. They were fighting with them. And that meant adapting, learning, changing. The coalition began restructuring its own forces, integrating human tactics, loosening rigid command systems, training units to operate independently, to think faster, to react without waiting for orders. It wasn't easy. It wasn't comfortable. But it was necessary. Because the war had changed. And so had the rules. Far beyond the front lines, in regions where no coalition ship had ventured since the war began, something else was happening. The Vark were gathering. Not scattered. Not advancing in waves. Concentrating. Massing their forces in ways they hadn't before. And at the center of it, something new. Larger. More complex. More aware. They had learned from Kelros. From the human tactics. From the kinetic weapons. From the unpredictability. And they were adapting. Faster now. More focused. Preparing for something bigger. Because for the first time, they had encountered resistance that mattered. And they were evolving to overcome it. Back in coalition space, as fleets assembled and plans took shape, one thing became clear to everyone involved. The war was no longer about survival alone. It was about who would adapt faster, who would learn more, who would strike first and strike harder. And somewhere between those two forces, humanity and the Vark, a new reality was forming. One that would decide the fate of the entire galaxy. Because the next battle would not be like Kelros. It would be larger, deadlier, and far less forgiving. And this time, both sides would be ready.